What's up everybody, Jeff here, and you've probably noticed that I've done a bunch of videos about Malifaux lore over the years. But one of the questions that always comes up is, where do you actually find all this lore? And one of the purposes of all these videos and the channel itself is really to spark interest in you guys and get you to go read the stories yourself, as well as to sort of serve as a guide for which stories you actually might be really interested in. So with that said, in this video, I'm going to take you through an overview of where all the lore comes from for Malifaux and what the different ways are that you can actually access it. That way, when you watch one of my lore guides, if there's a particular story that calls your attention, you can actually go seek it out and read it for yourself. While you're here, if you find this helpful, if you could please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also share the video, drop a comment, and do all the things to feed the algorithm. I'd really appreciate it. And I know a bunch of you always show up and do that stuff all the time, so thanks for that. There's also a link in the description to the Discord, so if you want to come over and chat about the lore, there's a whole bunch of people over there talking about all different kind of Malifaux stuff. And you'll also find a link to the Patreon, so if you want to support the channel directly, you can kick in a few bucks and get a bunch of perks on there. But with that, let's talk about the books. Now, I've heard a lot of people say that it's pretty intimidating to try to get into the lore for Malifaux because there's so much of it and they don't even know where to start. But I really don't think it's that bad. Now, you're probably thinking, but Defective Dice, you're the guy that spends hours and hours every week studying the lore and making videos about it. Of course you'd say it's not that bad. But bear with me. To start off, you should know that unlike a lot of war games that simply put out information about characters with data sheets and background information, Weird actually puts out narrative stories in almost every book they've ever published. They vary in length from a couple pages to over 20, and for the most part, they're surprisingly well done. I think this is a big part of the reason why people get so attached to the characters in this game, and it's certainly why this channel exists. So to start off, let's take a high-level look at where the narrative actually comes from. There's two primary sources for lore in Malifaux. One is the books that Weird puts out pretty much on a yearly basis, and the other is something called Weird Chronicles, which was a quarterly-ish magazine that Weird used to put out that had news, hobby stuff, tactics, as well as lore. If you take the books and the Weird Chronicles together, that's almost everything you need to know if you wanted to absorb all the lore for the game. And if you're interested in going through it all, this list right here is every Weird Chronicles and every book in order that they were published, to the best of my knowledge. That's the order that I've read them in, and luckily this isn't a Star Wars situation where you have to argue endlessly about the right order to read in. If you're looking to read everything, just read through it in this order. Very straightforward. So let's talk about the books. Pretty much annually, Weird puts out a new expansion for the game that includes new rules, new units, and new narrative stories. Now, this game's been kicking around for a while now, which means there's quite a few books out there. So let's take a quick look at what we're dealing with. In Malifaux 1st Edition, there were effectively 4 books. The first one was the core rules, which was later replaced by the 1.5 edition rules. But from a narrative perspective, they're basically the same thing. So we'll just count them together. We then had Rousing Powers, Twisting Fates, and Storm of Shadows. And that's 4 in total. In 2nd Edition, we have 5 books. 2nd Edition Core Rules, Crossroads, Shifting Loyalties, Ripples of Fate, and Broken Promises. After that, we had the release of The Other Side, which had a rulebook of its own that included plenty of narrative as well. And this sort of bridged the gap between the end of 2nd Edition and the beginning of 3rd Edition. Now, when 3rd Edition came out, it started getting a little complicated. Rather than doing one book that contained the rules as well as the narrative, Weird decided to put out the core rules as a separate book and then faction books for each one of the then 7 factions. Now, this was pretty awesome because it meant we got a ton of lore in one year. But it also meant that while the 3rd edition core rules had some background information about the history of the world and stuff like that, it didn't actually have any narrative. So for the most part, I ignore that book for the purposes of the lore. It has some really good background information, and it's definitely worth taking a look at. But most of that information is published in other places. So if you're going to skip any one book, that's probably the one to skip. Ironically, it's probably the one that everyone has. But oh well. So then we have each of the faction books: Arcanist, Bayou, Guild, Neverborn, Outcasts, Resurrectionist, Ten Thunders. And the following year saw the launch of the Explorer Society, and with it came their own book, right along those same lines. Then last year at the time of recording, we got Malifaux Burns, which sort of took us back to the traditional way, because it was a book that contained all the rules, and also had a big story. And then finally, we have the most recent release, which is Madness of Malifaux. Now there's a couple of other big changes that have taken place over the course of putting out all these books. But before we get to that, let's look at what's actually in most of the books. The core rulebooks usually contain some background information, talking about the origins of the Breach, what happened when the humans first came to Malifaux, the relationship of the Guild to the other factions, stuff like that. The books will also contain the stat cards for the units that get released at the same time. And generally speaking, each of them will also come with a couple paragraphs of flavor text for the character. It's usually not written in a narrative form. It's kind of just background and facts about the character. But it's still really good information. Some of the books will also have little call-out boxes that'll contain just miscellaneous facts or fluff about people and places that aren't really focused on anywhere else in the book, but they just throw them in for a little extra flavor. And then there's the actual narrative. In many of the books, this actually takes up the bulk of the actual pages, and this is where we get a lot of variety over the course of the 3 editions. Back in 1st edition, the stories tended to be heavily serialized. What I mean by that is that every story in the book was a little snippet about what's going on with one character or another. but each one of them fed into the same overall plot. So for example, in the first book, we learn about what the Victorias, Ramos, Seamus, Sonia, and a bunch of other characters are up to. But by the end, the whole plot leads to the events at Kythera, with December and the Grave Spirit and all that good stuff. It's structured like a bunch of short stories, but they're kind of all following the same plot, just from different perspectives. Similarly, in Rising Powers, the story is all leading up to the incident with Hamlin and lowering the red cage that caused the event. There's lots of different characters involved, but everything sort of feeds into that main plot. And even in Twisting Fates, the main plot is about Sharufe and Sonia Crid. And while this book gets a little bit further away from the main plot, the story arc still primarily focuses on those events. Storm of Shadows is where things start to really change. This is the book that introduced the Ten Thunders as their own faction, and rather than having one main plot that the stories all fed into, it was kind of structured as a bunch of standalone stories that didn't necessarily have anything to do with each other. And this would kind of become the standard for many years going forward. I suspect part of that is because by this point there were so many masters and important characters that it became very hard to write one story that everybody was involved in. In the first book, almost every master was involved in the story, and they all interacted with each other in different ways. But now in 3rd edition, we have around 60 masters plus all the other characters, so that's kind of impossible. So going back, all 5 books of 2nd edition kind of follow that structure. Lots of smaller stories that deal with different characters and don't necessarily tie into each other. Now, some of them still had a sort of A-plot, or a longer story in them, that tended to move the narrative forward in a more significant way, even if many of the other stories in the book had nothing to do with them. So for example, Shifting Loyalties ends with a story where the Governor General tries to do the ritual to ascend, and inadvertently makes the Burning Man. Ripples of Fate sees Titania return, and it's also interesting because it has sections called the Vignettes, where we get a little status update on each of the masters in the game, and many of those actually advance the story of those masters pretty significantly. And then Broken Promises, which is probably one of my favorite books, has a bunch of really significant stories, and again, they're not all related to each other, but we see a lot of plot advancement for each of the factions. For example, in this book, Ramos finally gets captured, all the outcasts decide to move out to the Badlands, Lenny Jones gets elected Gremlin General, and Masaki takes over the Ten Thunders. All really good stuff. Now, when we start getting into 3rd edition, we really expand the scope and the number of stories that we got in the books. Once again, there's no real through line, or A-plot, that everything ties into, but the vast majority of characters got featured in a story, in one way or another. Many of the stories serve to explain why different characters either changed factions, or went into the Dead Man's Hand. So we saw how Collodi died, and how Jacob Lynch got chased out of the Neverborn. And we continued this pattern into the Explorer Society book, but many of those stories really served as the origin stories for some of those characters, because most of them were brand new. And then we come to the release of Malifaux Burns, and this is where we kind of go back to the old school. Malifaux Burns has lots of new rules in it, because it saw the release of all the title masters. But the narrative in the book is actually only one story called Malifaux Burns. It focused primarily on the 8 masters who were affected by the Burning Man, and while it did jump around from perspective to perspective, and feature all the different characters, they went further than feeding into the same story like the early books did, because they literally were all the same story. And this pattern was continued with the release of Madness of Malifaux. Now, I won't get into any spoilers for Madness of Malifaux, because at the time of recording, it's still only been out for about a week, and a lot of people haven't gotten their hands on it yet. But suffice to say, it follows a very similar structure, where we get a bunch of new characters with their little bio entries, and the narrative follows one story that jumps around between perspectives of many different characters. I'll be curious to see if Weird keeps up this pattern, and we keep just getting the main story, as opposed to the more scattershot stories that we saw in 2nd edition. I think each style has its pros and cons. It's nice to have a primary plot, where we can see some actual story advancement and changes in the world. But I also really liked a lot of the stories in 2nd edition, and we tended to see a wider variety of characters featured, whereas, for example, the Malifaux Burns story pretty much only touched on 8 to 10 characters. Weird Chronicles was a magazine that Weird used to put out for free, starting from before 1st edition came out, and ending a couple of years ago. Each edition would have things like interviews, buyer's guides, hobby guides, tactics discussions, and news, but each of them would also contain 1 or 2 stories to add to the Malifaux narrative. These stories actually tended to be pretty long, and while most of them focused on unknown characters, who didn't really tie into the rest of the narrative, some of the stories from Weird Chronicles were actually super important. For example, we get some early hints at what the Governor General was plotting before he tried to become a tyrant, and we also get the story arc where Lady J and Nicodem go head to head, and we all know how that turned out. Rip Nicodem. Now, an interesting note is that when Weird decided to officially cancel Weird Chronicles, they mentioned that the type of content we used to see in them was going to start getting published on Waldos Weekly, or something similar on the website, and that way we'd start to see it on a little bit more regular basis, instead of all at once in a quarterly magazine. And for the most part, we haven't really seen that happen yet. We have seen a couple of narrative bits and pieces popping up in Waldos Weekly, which we'll touch on in a bit, but it hasn't been nearly as much as we used to get out of the Weird Chronicles, and I for one really hope that Weird follows through on this, and starts putting out some stories in between the release of the new books. Now, on to the important question. How do you get this stuff? For the rulebooks, each one of them has been put out in a print copy, as well as in PDF form. Now, some of those books are pretty old, but I have seen them still out in the wild, available for sale. They probably won't be easy to find, but if you keep your ear to the ground, you can definitely get a hold of them if you want to. The newer books should be pretty easy to get. Check out your friendly local game store, or hop on Weird's web store, or another online retailer, and see how many of the different books are available. Alternatively, you can check DriveThruRPG. It's a website that sells stuff related to RPGs and wargames, and every one of the weird books is available for sale on their site in PDF form. So if you don't mind reading them electronically, this is the easiest way to get them. In addition, every edition of the Weird Chronicles is available on DriveThruRPG, and they're all totally free. So if you're looking to dip your toe in, go make a free account on there and just download a couple of copies and check them out. Now, maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, but Defective Dice, I listen to your channel because I don't like reading. I much prefer to listen to somebody else read things to me. And if that's the case, well, you're in luck. I really hope I'm not the first one to tell you this. But Weird has such a dedication to their lore and the universe that they've built that they also produce a podcast where they're going through all the stories from the books and the Weird Chronicles, reading them to you word by word, with voice actors who are way better than I am, and additional production. Oh, and they're all free. Did I mention they're free? Yeah, if you weren't convinced that Weird really cares about their lore and their characters, I think this should pretty much seal the deal. The podcast is really incredibly well done. And for anyone who prefers audiobooks, or just doesn't feel like going and collecting all the books, this is a really great way to consume all the lore. They're not quite done with covering every story, but they put them out pretty much weekly, and at that rate they'll get caught up pretty quick. Just to give a really quick overview of how this works, the Breachside broadcast Tales of Malifaux covers the narrative stories from all the rulebooks. The Breachside broadcast Chronicles covers the stories from Weird Chronicles, and the Earthside Echoes covers stories from the TOS rulebook. I definitely recommend going and checking it out. It'll be linked in the description below. And if you've never gotten into the lore directly, other than watching my videos, you should definitely go pull up the Breachside broadcast and listen to an episode or two. I think you'll be really impressed. So maybe you listen to all that and you're saying to yourself, narrative stories are good, character bios are fun, but I need more nitty gritty. I need more details. I want to learn more about bureaucracy and city planning and all that really fun, crunchy, nerdy stuff. Well, more great news. Weird also puts out a tabletop RPG called Through the Breach, and Through the Breach has several books of its own, including the core rules, and several expansions focused on many of the in-world factions. Now, these books don't really have any narrative per se, but they're all dripping with information and background if you want to learn more about the setting and different places and people. For example, if you want to know how I knew Castor was coming to the game, long before Weird ever said his name, well, that's because I read the From Nightmares book. They gave us just enough information about Castor to connect the dots and predict that he'd be coming to the game soon. Each of these books starts off with some history and backstory to explain the origins of the faction, and then goes through and gives some detail about notable places around the world where you might find people from this faction. For example, in the Under Quarantine book, the one focused on the Resurrectionists, we get lots of detail about the different sections of the quarantine zone and what kind of horrible things we might encounter there. We often then get information on notable people from the faction, so if you want to learn about Castor, or Lilith and Nakima's mother, who was a buddy of Castor's, then all that information can be found in From Nightmares, the Neverborn expansion. Each of them then has rules for the RPG that are related to the faction, so we get things like lists of weapons and armor, and unique magical spells that are associated with that faction. And finally, we have a bestiary, where we get some data sheets for enemies that you might face in the RPG, and each of them also comes with a little entry similar to what we see in the normal books, with some information about those creatures or characters. Interestingly, a lot of the stuff that comes to the skirmish game actually first gets seen in the RPG books a few years earlier. Now, these books are not as easy to read because they're not really written as a story. It's more just pages and pages of information and data. And there's no podcast to have them read to you. But if you really want to get into it and learn as much as you can about the world, definitely check out the Through the Breach books because you can get some really cool information. And if you've never played the RPG and you want to give it a shot, I've been running a series of the pre-written one-shots that Weird has put out, and you're all invited to play. So if you're interested, head over to the Discord and check out the announcements tab for more information. Now, that's a ton of stuff, but there's a couple of other quick things that I want to mention, because there's a few more places that you can pick up a little bit of lore. Since Weird Chronicles has been canceled, there have been a couple of articles that included some narrative stuff that have gone up in Waldos Weekly. For example, there was a story about what some of the soldiers in the King's Empire were doing during the Battle of London. There have also been a couple of worldwide events that Weird has run over the years that have actually decided how some of the narrative has gone. For example, it's how we got characters like Tara and Ferdinand Vogel. Those events had a bunch of narrative that went along with them, but they're actually pretty hard to find on the internet nowadays. I'll see if I can get the links together to as many of them as I know about, and put them in the description as well. And finally, we have the Penny Dreadfuls. These are pre-written RPG adventures that Weird has put out, including the bigger books that usually contain 5 or so adventures, the Penny Dreadful one-shots that are available on DriveThruRPG, as well as the adventures that were published in the Weird Chronicles. Now, many of these contain background information and story stuff, but it's not quite clear how much of them are actually considered canon. In many of the adventures, the players will actually influence what happens, so it would be hard to say what's canon and what isn't, but a lot of them do contain some good information and background for different parts of the setting, so I don't want to leave them out entirely. And that's all the different ways that you can get some Malifaux lore. Now, as I mentioned earlier, part of the reason I started this channel was to help get people interested in the setting, and to help identify which stories they might be interested in, so they can go check them out for themselves. Now, I'm hoping that this video will help you do that, and when you're watching any episode of the Lore Guide, if you hear something that sounds super interesting, then check the description, because it'll tell you where that story came from, so you can go check it out for yourself. Some of the videos will also list the episode of the Breachside broadcast that covers that story, and eventually I'm going to go in and backfill all the older videos, so you can use those for reference as well. But drop me a comment below and let me know. Before watching this, did you know about the Weird Chronicles and the Breachside broadcast? There's a ton ton of free ways to get the lore for Malifaux, and I think it's really cool that Weird makes it so easy for people to get stuck in. And if you did know about all those things, then let us all know what your favorite story is for Malifaux, and why you like it so much. That's one of my favorite conversations to have, and it's really interesting to find out what stories stuck with different people, and why. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share. Join the Discord if you want to come chat with me. I'm pretty active on there and we have a good group. And if you really appreciate what I do, then head over to Patreon and consider contributing as little as $2. It goes a long way to helping the channel. On that note, huge shout out to the extremely cool kids tier on Patreon, Steam Powered Scoundrels, and Dogmatize. And thanks for watching.